We are back with part 3 of our look at the artist Pierre-Auguste Renoir. And we start with a pretty simple little still life here. This is a little bit out of context with the other work we're looking at, but it's also a reminder that Renoir is very much doing the art of the time, trying to fit in. We have a couple things that we can look at. First is the print in the background. This is a small etching actually done by the artist Edouard Monet of a Velázquez painting. Velázquez actually was of big influence on the people of the time. Another couple things you might notice is the Japanese fan and also the Japanese vase. Both of these are from this wave of Orientalism that we have at this time within Paris, mostly brought on by the World Exhibition and the Japanese booth that was actually there. Many of the artists were exposed to Japanese prints and Japanese art for the first time. When we start to look at who he's painting at this time, it's actually a lot of the Monet family. As I mentioned, he's kind of a monogamist when it comes to painting women, and this is definitely true. During this period, we see quite a bit of Claude Monet's wife, Camille. In this painting from 1872, this is a very simple portrait. You can see excellent use of the color blue kind of flowing in between the background and also what she's wearing. Again, this is very close to when Claude Monet and his family will be living in the Argentine region. Renoir very famously lived very close to them as well. He was very close to their family. It was said that when he was so close, in fact, that they had a little bed set up for them at their house in the Argentine region. It is also said that the Monet family was, of course, extraordinarily poor, and that Renoir would bring little pieces of food from his house. He was living with his parents close by over to them. Here we have a portrait of Camille Monet reading on a very, very large couch. And again, we see this Orientalism kind of popping through with the fans in the background. And again, we can kind of be reminded through this painting of Renoir's background as a porcelain painter. When we look at the delicacy and the detail that we have on her clothing and also on the couch behind her that she's laying on, we actually have two different kind of sets of details, a larger pattern set on the couch itself, and then a different kind of more intimate pattern that we have on her clothing. But again, it's a very busy type of painting with the amount of information that Renoir is pushing forward. It's very hard to find any breathing room. The only space is really the blue in the background, which again very much matches the blue that he's using with her clothing. Here we have a portrait of Claude Monet reading, again from the same time period. Claude, of course, was one of the four from the first group that we really have leading forward, and he's living in this the region around Argentine, painting the Seine River and looking at the effects of the water. And this is the second point that we really see between these two artists, kind of as this developing period, with both Monet and Renoir working very, very close together. Outside of the Fontainebleau forest, but still painting water and landscapes and that type of feeling, a lot of paintings of gardens and that type of thing, looking and really developing what the Impressionistic style could do for them beyond just capturing the effects of light. Here, when we look at a closer example of a person, again, Claude Monet, you can see that Renoir is now using that type of brushstroke, that choppy type of brushstroke on his clothing. Here we have Monet painting in his garden. Monet very famously said he was two good things he was good at, gardening and painting. So I guess Renoir put them into one single painting. This is also where we start to see what I think of as the Kaleidoscope Renoir, where he embraces almost every color you can possibly imagine. When we look at something like this from 1873, this is a wonderful example where you could almost spend a few minutes with a color wheel looking at the painting, trying to find every single color imaginable somewhere within the painting itself, from the yellow flowers to the red flowers to the green foliage to the blue that we see in Monet's clothing, to the different shades of yellow in the background as we peer off into the cityscape behind them. Again, Renoir is very famous for doing this, for using this entire palette of colors rather than having just a select palette. Here we have a very famous painting. This is Camille, Monet, and their son Jean in the garden, the same garden we just saw Monet painting in. And again, as the story goes, Renoir showed up one day and did not have any equipment and kind of borrowed it. But we see once again Camille Monet as the center of the portrait and the green flowing background that doesn't really even look like a space as much as a green backdrop with a tree in it, flattening out the space, bringing forward the colors that we see. Again, the greens that you can see in their Saint Jean laying in the foreground. But again, this is Renoir. The kaleidoscope effect is there. We can also see the uses of blues and yellows and reds throughout the landscape. Noticeably, the red that we see on both the rooster carrying forward to the top left corner of the flowers, peeking into the landscape. And as the story goes, this is this wonderful moment in time when we have two very famous artists painting the exact same composition. Again, the Renoir painting is on the right, and on the left we have a painting by Edward Manet, who also was in the region at the time, stopped by and again was painting the exact same composition from a different perspective. Here you can really kind of see the change of generations and by the way they're looking at the perspective. Again, Manet is really trying to create a realistic type of space. We can wander our eyes off into the distance. We have a definite sense that the tree is behind them and that even Claude Monet is off a little bit farther behind them. With again the Renoir, everything seems flattened and it's more about the color than the perspective of space. You hear, of course, of Manet commenting that Renoir's composition is not that good, but you know, what can you do? So we move over to one of my favorite paintings from this period, The Harvesters. Again, when we think of the Impressionist effect, we usually think of an outdoor scene, and here Renoir does a wonderful job of creating a composition within this kind of parameter. If you look at the wonderful blue sky that is almost bisecting the composition that leads us down to the wonderful set of yellows that we have, and again we have these darker tones, possibly black, possibly darker blues leading towards black, filling in these compositions, almost dotting their way through the brilliant yellows that he has set up. And we have that wonderful little farmhouse in the distance creating a sense of perspective. You can almost take the dots of black from the farmhouse to the two people walking, to the man's trousers, to the other man's trousers, following a line, a pin of almost dots from one side of the composition to the other. Woman with a Parasol is another quite famous painting from this time, and even though it says Woman with a Parasol, we can imagine this to be Camille Monet one more time and their son Jean off on an excursion. The interesting thing is, if you know the work of Monet, he has several paintings that are very, very similar to this composition, where Woman with a Parasol is very the title of the work, and oftentimes you will see their young son Jean in the painting as well. Again, this could just be simply that they were all out together one day and decided to paint. Here we see what Renoir starts to really do with the Impressionist technique, though. As we close in on Camille's face, we see this aspect of reality or realism really popping out, and as we move farther away, we can see more and more of this type of impressionistic brushstroke. Another point of reality would be, of course, the back of Jean's head. This leads us forward to the 1874 Impressionist exhibition, the first Impressionist exhibition, and the very famous painting that Renoir showed in the show, La Loge, or the theater box. And, you know, the idea that everyone did not do well in the Impressionist show was not quite correct, as it shows here. Renoir actually sold 3 paintings, including this one, which was thought of as the prize of the show. He sold this painting for exactly the amount of money it would need to pay his rent for that month. Here we have a scene kind of the opposite of the Degas, with a couple within the theater box, the Paris, opera house. The Garnier opera house would have its grand opening in 1875, but again, it would be opened a little bit before this as well. We have individuals within here, and again, if you think of them in a theater box, here we have two very early versions of it as well. We know that this is, again, this idea that only the wealthy elite would be going to these type of things. And again, when we see this couple here, you can see that Renoir was very much playing around with the composition, seeing what he would want to do. And when we look at the final version that we started this with, again, the people are facing towards us rather than the side angle that we see. Again, that final composition is the one that we usually think of when we think of La Loge, the box. But again, this is an interior scene, and the Impressionistic technique is something that he's carrying forward into these paintings. As I mentioned, he starts to develop this kind of technique where we have these hints of realism, and then the rest of the image kind of fades farther and farther into this kind of choppy brushstroke impressionistic technique that we think of. When we look at something like this, we can see the face of this, the reader from 1874, is much more of an impressionistic type of brushstroke than we see from even the paintings before, with this sense of realism kind of peeking through. Here we can almost see the thick brushstrokes developing on the canvas, and again, this was kind of the idea carried forward from Edward Manet's work, that you can see the brushstrokes active on the canvas surface rather than them being blended into a solid flat plane of color. Again, looking at this, the kaleidoscopic effect, we can see the blues and the greens, the yellows, and we even have some reds peeking through on the woman's left lips as well as her scarf, and just a tiny bit of red also in the binding of the book, which is very well accented to the scarf itself. You can also see just a tiny bit of pink in her cheeks as well. Here we have another composition of a young woman with a veil from 1875, again after the what we think of as the first Impressionist exhibition. Again, here we see a very thick use of black, and the very challenging task, of course, of painting a veil with a woman's face behind it. This is a much more somber kind of feel to this composition, and again, we have the woman looking away from us into a darkened space rather than looking back towards us with a cheerful mood. Renoir is very famous for making very happy paintings, very joyful compositions, and if nothing else, when we look at this, this is a little bit of a darker painting, which kind of sticks out a bit when we think of Renoir. There's only a very few amounts of paintings I can think of that have this kind of somber feel to them. He is kind of renowned for more of a joyful approach to the conversation of painting. With paintings that look more like this, also done in 1875 around the same period. He will be pretty renowned for painting children, especially later on. He receives a lot of commissions to paint more of the wealthy elite children, but I think this is a wonderful example of the joyful Renoir we see from 1875, the very famous red. Again, all of the colors you can imagine you might find somewhere in this composition, a very cheerful perspective on the world. And if we look at the lacing, the fine lacing that the young lady has on her clothing, again, a reminder of the fine brush skills that Renoir developed even at a very early age. As I mentioned before, this technique that Renoir is developing where we get these hints at realism. Again, if we look at the child's face in comparison to the watering can, you can see what I'm talking about. The face is very realistic, the watering can drifting away. Here another example of that type of effect. If you look at the young woman's face and even the candles on the piano, these are very much grounded in the concept of realism. And as we float away from that, Renoir uses hints of Impressionism, this kind of haziness, this wonderful haziness developing as in the corners of the painting. Here he uses the black lacing on the woman's dress to kind of lead the eye from the woman's head as where we would first kind of glance down through the rest of the composition and eventually around up to that large black vase that we have in the background. Again, this is the type of style that we really see from Renoir around 1876, around the time of the second Impressionist exhibition.